Tonight, we drift back to the early 1990s when computers still felt like quiet furniture, beige towers under desks, soft fans turning, a monitor glowing with a kind of patient effort. The world on those screens was mostly flat, made of windows and icons, and yet you could already sense a hunger for depth, for movement, for something that looked more like the world outside the room. In cinemas, new computer imagery was beginning to shimmer and convince. Dinosaurs breathing in moonlit rain, impossible scenes made believable by patient calculation. In arcades and living rooms, games were leaning toward illusion. Corridors that seemed to stretch away, creatures that lurked in shadow, textures that hinted at stone and metal, even if they were made of clever pixels. On a PC, though, the central processor did almost everything, and it was tired. Asked to calculate logic, sound, input, and then, on top of it all, the heavy math of drawing a three-dimensional scene. The result was often a kind of compromise, a stutter between frames, a world that wanted to be smooth but could only manage a rough sketch of itself. And in that moment, in Silicon Valley air that smelled faintly of solder and coffee, three engineers began circling a simple idea. What if the work of seeing could be separated from the work of thinking? What if there were a dedicated chip, built for repetition and rhythm, doing many small visual calculations at once, so the main processor could breathe and the images could flow? In 1993, Jensen Huang, Chris Malachowski, and Curtis Preem started a new company with that question tucked inside it, and they gave it a name that sounded like a bright place beyond the horizon. NVIDIA. The story says their first serious conversations happened in an ordinary diner over breakfast, the kind of place where the coffee keeps coming and big ideas can feel strangely practical. They were not alone in chasing the future, not at all. Dozens of companies were building graphics chips, each trying to become the one that mattered, each racing to survive the next product cycle. So, from the beginning, there was pressure in the background, like a steady clock. Deadlines, prototypes, decisions that could not be undone once the silicon was made. But there is a particular kind of calm that comes from being early, from committing to something before it is obvious, before it has a market with a neat label and a confident number attached to it. Tonight, as the world slows, we'll follow that quiet commitment, from the first uncertain designs to the moment a new kind of processor began to lift the weight of images from the shoulders of the CPU. We won't rush, and you don't have to remember a thing. Just listen for the gentle hum of machines and the way a few patient decisions can, over time, reshape what the world is able to imagine. In the beginning, the future did not arrive as a clean, confident breakthrough, but as a messy pile of possibilities. Sound, video, controller ports, and graphics all tugging at the same small chip. NVIDIA's first attempt in the mid-1990s tried to be everything at once, like a multi-tool carried into a storm, and for a moment it felt clever, even elegant on paper. But the world outside the lab had its own preferences, and software developers were gathering around new standards, choosing the simplest shapes to build their 3D worlds. Triangles, predictable and fast. When the chip arrived, the market did what markets often do. It shrugged, it moved on, and it returned boxes that had once seemed like a promise. Inside the company, the room grew quieter, not with despair, but with focus, because a young team learns quickly that silicon is unforgiving and there is no undo once the design is baked. They were surrounded by competitors, too, a whole crowded field of graphics companies, each racing to make the next card, each hoping to be the name printed on the box. It was the kind of era where magazines compared frame rates the way people once compared engines, and gamers could feel the difference between smooth motion and a world that stumbled. So NVIDIA narrowed its gaze, letting go of the octopus dream and choosing a simpler goal. Make one thing work beautifully and make it arrive on time. In those months, time became a texture, like sand in a pocket, because there is a special pressure when you know you have only one more product cycle to earn your right to continue. And yet, there was also craft. Engineers running long simulations, testing a design before it ever touched a factory, listening for errors the way you might listen for a creak in an old house at night. When the new chip finally landed, it worked and it sold, and it did what it was meant to do. It helped images move more smoothly, and it gave the company another morning. Tonight, we can hold that moment gently, because it's not triumph or failure that defines a long story, but endurance, the steady choice to try again with clearer eyes. It was around the time when games like Quake were teaching the eye to expect depth, and when each new graphics card felt like a new pair of glasses. The same world, but sharper. The chip's name mattered less than its timing, but people remember it as one of the rival cards, an unromantic word that nonetheless became a bridge back to stability. And once the bridge was built, the pace changed, because survival has a way of sharpening decisions. The team could now iterate faster, learn faster, and keep the fan hum steady through the night. With stability came a quiet kind of confidence, and with confidence came permission to think bigger, not louder, just deeper. In 1999, NVIDIA introduced a new card under a new name, GeForce, and with it, they offered a phrase that would stick: the Graphics Processing Unit, or GPU. It was, in a sense, a small act of renaming the world, because until then, graphics were treated as an accessory, a helper, something the CPU could manage if it had enough time. But time was exactly what games did not have, because a moving world cannot pause while the processor catches its breath, and the eye will always notice the hesitation. So, the GPU was designed to take on the repeated work of transforming 3D shapes, calculating light, preparing triangles, and pushing pixels, a specialized rhythm done in parallel, like many hands folding the same kind of paper. This was not only about beauty, though beauty mattered, but about freeing the CPU to do what it did best. Logic, decisions, the subtle choreography of a game's rules. If you played in those years, you may remember the feeling of a new graphics card like a secret upgrade to reality. Corridors in Quake 3 that suddenly felt smoother, arenas that shimmered without tearing. The GPU also carried something else, almost hidden at first. It was becoming more programmable, less like a fixed tool and more like a small machine that could learn new tricks. That shift would take years to fully unfold, but you can already sense it here, like a door cracked open in a quiet hallway. Around this same time, NVIDIA's chips began to appear not only in PCs, but in the broader culture of gaming hardware, as console makers looked for graphics power that felt both affordable and advanced. A console is, in its own way, a promise of consistency. The same experience for everyone, the same frames, the same light, the same reliable hum, and NVIDIA wanted to be part of that steadiness. So the company kept moving generation by generation, each one a little faster, a little more capable, each one teaching developers to expect more from what a screen could hold. And beneath it all was a calm idea that would later become enormous, that some work is better done by many simple processors acting together, rather than one processor doing everything alone. When NVIDIA called it a GPU, it was partly a statement of ambition, not just a faster graphics chip, but a new class of processor built to do a certain kind of math with steady repetition. It was the beginning of a long relationship between silicon and imagination, where artists and engineers met in the middle, one drawing what they wished to see, the other finding a way to compute it in time. In the early 2000s, the world of games grew more cinematic, not because stories became louder, but because light and texture became more convincing. A wall could look like stone instead of a pattern, a sky could fade gently instead of switching colors, and shadows could suggest distance the way evening does. This happened through a quiet evolution called programmability. Small pieces of code called shaders that told the GPU how to color a pixel or bend a surface like instructions whispered to a brush. For developers, this was a new palette, and for players, it was a gradual shift in expectation, as if the mind learned to believe the screen a little more each year. NVIDIA and its rivals pushed each other forward, and generation by generation, the numbers climbed. More transistors, more memory bandwidth, more parallel work per heartbeat. The cultural world around it changed, too, because gaming moved from basements to bedrooms, from a private hobby to a shared language. You might remember LAN parties, the glow of monitors in a dim room, the soft clatter of keyboards, and the quick laughter between rounds. Later came broadband, and then the strange comfort of watching someone else play, as if the act of play could become a story you listened to while doing something else. Platforms like YouTube and Twitch would eventually make that watching feel effortless, But even before they were household names, the need was already there. The desire to share a moment in real time. A GPU helped with that as well, because the same parallel power that drew a game could also help compress it into a stream, turning private pixels into a public broadcast. And slowly, without any single turning point, games became arenas, and arenas became events, and events became a kind of modern gathering lit by screens instead of stadium lights. Through it all, NVIDIA kept refining the craft of fast drawing, building not only chips, but a relationship with developers, tools, drivers, and the gentle promise that next year's hardware would make new ideas possible. In that era, names like DirectX and OpenGL floated through conversations, not as dry acronyms, but as common roads that everyone agreed to travel, so games could run on many machines. NVIDIA's chips found their way into consoles as well, and if you ever held an original Xbox controller, heavy and sure in the hands, there was a bit of NVIDIA's work helping that world feel smooth. Even when you didn't know the chip's name, you could sense its effect. The steadier frame rate, the richer scenes, the feeling that the machine was keeping up with your intention. All of this was still graphics, officially, yet it carried a hidden lesson that parallel computation, done well, could make complex experiences feel simple. At some point, usually in the middle of a long technology story, people begin to use a tool for something it was not built to do. They do it quietly at first, in labs and late nights, not to rebel, but to see what happens when you turn a familiar object slightly and look at it from another angle. A GPU, after all, was already a machine for repeating simple math very quickly, and many scientific problems are also made of repeated math, stacked like waves. So, researchers began to wonder, if a GPU can apply light to millions of pixels, could it also apply equations to millions of data points? In the early days, this was awkward, like writing poetry with a screwdriver, because programming a GPU meant pretending your problem was a graphics problem. You would encode numbers as colors, calculations as textures, and you would work through the constraints with patient creativity. But when it worked, it felt like a small miracle. A simulation that once took days could finish in hours, and the computer seemed to breathe in a new way. NVIDIA noticed these experiments, and instead of dismissing them as edge cases, they listened, because listening is often how a company discovers its next life. The question became sharper. What if we made it normal to program the GPU directly, not as a graphics trick, but as a computing platform? That idea would require software, tools, a new language of sorts, and a willingness to invite people into the chip's inner rhythm. It also required humility, because it meant admitting that the future might not be only about games, even if games had built the company. So, as the world kept playing, NVIDIA began preparing another doorway, one that would lead from rendering scenes to accelerating science. Tonight, we can feel that doorway as a soft draft in a hallway. the hint of a larger room beyond, filled with equations, data, and the steady hum of parallel machines. A CPU is like a careful solo thinker, stepping through tasks one by one, while a GPU is more like a choir. Many small voices, each singing a simple note at the same time. When the notes line up, the result is not just faster, but different, because problems that were too large to attempt can suddenly be held in memory and worked on patiently. Think of medical images reconstructed from many slices, or seismic readings turned into maps of hidden rock, or molecules simulated as they fold and bump in liquid. All of it made of repeating math, all of it hungry for parallel effort. In those years, the people doing this work often built their own clusters from ordinary graphics cards stacked in metal frames with extra fans, turning gaming hardware into homemade supercomputers. It was an improvised kind of progress, but it carried a clear message. The GPU was ready to become something more. In 2006, NVIDIA opened that doorway with a name that sounded like a quiet spark: CUDA. CUDA was a way of speaking to the GPU more directly, letting programmers write ordinary-looking code and letting the GPU translate it into thousands of tiny parallel steps. It did not change the laws of physics, but it changed who could use them, because you no longer had to disguise your work as graphics to access the GPU's power. Now a researcher could say, in plain terms, take this matrix, apply this operation, repeat it across the data, and do it all at once. The GPU, in response, would not think harder, but it would work wider, spreading the task across many cores, each one doing a small piece with steady patience. NVIDIA began to build products specifically for this world. GPUs intended for data centers and labs, often sold not as shiny gaming cards, but as accelerators, quiet engines bolted into racks. This was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat again and again. Hardware paired with an ecosystem, software paired with community, the chip and the tools growing together. Scientists used CUDA to speed up simulations. Engineers used it to test designs, and universities began teaching the new approach, training students to think in parallel. If you stood in one of those labs, you might hear the same familiar sound as in a gaming PC: fans, airflow, a constant hum. But the work inside was different. Instead of drawing dragons or stadiums, the GPUs were tracing protein folds, reconstructing CT scans, simulating fluids, or searching patterns in noisy signals. And still, nothing about it felt flashy, because the best infrastructure rarely does. It simply makes the impossible feel routine, and the routine feel gentle. What began as an experiment at the edges was becoming a second foundation beneath the company, and NVIDIA was learning how to stand on both the playful world of games and the patient world of science. In some places, professors built clusters from off-the-shelf cards, lining them up like books on a shelf, cooling them with box fans, and calling it a personal supercomputer. And as these experiments spread, large supercomputing centers began to take notice because the math was persuasive. For certain workloads, one GPU could replace many CPUs. Before long, the fastest machines in the world were mixing processors the way a good kitchen mixes tools. CPUs for general work, GPUs for the heavy parallel stirring, each doing what it did best. The idea of accelerated computing began to sound less like a slogan and more like a new normal, a calm shift in how the world's hardest problems would be approached. By the early 2010s, another quiet community was gathering around GPUs, not because of graphics, but because of learning. Machine learning had existed for a long time, like a library of ideas waiting for the right kind of electricity, but it often felt slow and limited by the available compute. Deep neural networks, in particular, needed two things to truly flourish: large data sets and an immense amount of repeated math. That repeated math was mostly linear algebra, the kind of multiplication and addition that can be broken into many small pieces and done in parallel, like raindrops on a window. In 2012, a group of researchers trained a deep network to recognize images in a major competition, and they used GPUs to do it, because without GPUs, it would have taken far too long. The results were not a small improvement. They were a clear leap, a sudden drop in error that made the field look up and pay attention. It was one of those moments that feels later like a hinge, a door swinging open, revealing a new room in the house of technology. After that, more people tried deep learning because the path was now visible. If you can train a network faster, you can iterate, and iteration is how intuition becomes progress. NVIDIA, watching this, understood something important. The GPU had become a general engine for modern pattern recognition. A network learns by adjusting countless tiny weights, nudging them again and again, and the GPU's parallel structure made that nudging feasible at scale. The company began to serve this emerging world with more intention. Better software libraries, specialized hardware features, whole systems designed to train models efficiently. And while the public still thought of GPUs as gaming parts, in quiet server rooms, the story was shifting, because the same silicon that drew game worlds was now helping machines see. You could almost feel the cultural change approaching. Cameras everywhere, data everywhere, and the growing sense that computers might learn from experience rather than only follow explicit rules. In the SleepWise calm of this night, we can hold that change softly, not as a sudden explosion, but as a slow dawn, the kind that brightens the sky before anyone notices. The benchmark was called ImageNet, and its millions of labeled pictures were like a training ground for digital vision, a way to measure whether a machine could recognize a cat, a street sign, a face. The network that won, often remembered as AlexNet, was trained on consumer GPUs, the kind someone could buy for a gaming PC, and that detail mattered. It meant the new era did not require a secret government machine, only the right approach. Soon, the Internet's endless photos and videos became more than content. They became data, and the GPU became the quiet mill that could grind that data into learned ability. Once a new door opens, the world tends to rush through it, but NVIDIA moved in its own way, deliberate, building not a single product, but an entire path. The company began to speak more often about accelerated computing, about GPUs in data centers, about a future where training a model would be as common as hosting a website. To make that future easier, they built complete machines designed for AI, boxes of GPUs tuned to work together like a small orchestra in a single chassis. These systems had names like DGX, but the names were less important than the feeling they offered, that AI training could be packaged, repeatable, and reliable. They also refined the chips themselves, adding features meant for the new workload. Circuits that sped up the matrix math of neural networks, doing the same kind of multiplication again and again with less energy. People sometimes called those features tensor cores, but you can think of them as a gentle shortcut, a way of making the most common steps in learning faster and smoother. At the same time, gaming did not disappear. It continued vivid and bright, and NVIDIA kept improving the visual magic too, even introducing ray tracing, a technique that imitates how light bounces. It was an unusual balance. 1 foot in play, 1 foot in research, and both supported by the same foundational idea of parallel work. In server rooms, the GPUs began to cluster in large groups, linked by fast connections, because training bigger models meant coordinating many chips as if they were one machine. This is where the story begins to feel less like a consumer tale and more like infrastructure, the kind of technology you rarely see, but you depend on all the same. And yet, even infrastructure has a mood, and the mood here was steady ambition, the patient confidence that if you build the right platform, others will build wonders on top of it. So NVIDIA kept doing what it had learned in its earliest years: iterate, refine, and listen, while the hum of computation grew a little louder in the background of the modern world. Cloud companies began offering GPUs by the hour, as if parallel compute were a kind of calm utility, and researchers rented time the way earlier generations rented film cameras. Software frameworks like TensorFlow and PyTorch made it easier to describe learning models, and beneath them, NVIDIA's libraries helped the GPU do the heavy lifting with quiet efficiency. In this way, the GPU became less like a component and more like a place, an environment, where ideas could run, repeat, and improve while humans slept and the machines kept training. The world was entering an era where progress often meant more data, more compute, and more patience. And NVIDIA had positioned itself at the center of that triangle. As AI models grew larger, something surprising became obvious. It wasn't enough to have fast chips. You also needed fast conversation between chips. Training a large model is like teaching a choir a new song. Each section can practice its part, but they must hear each other to stay in time. So the network inside a data center became as important as the processors themselves, and NVIDIA began to think about the whole system, not just the GPU. That thinking led them to buy Mellanox, a company known for high-speed networking, the kind used in supercomputers where every microsecond matters. With that, NVIDIA could offer not only the engines that compute, but the pathways that move data, connecting racks and nodes into one coordinated organism. Jensen Huang often described a data center as a single giant computer spread across many machines, and it's a calming image, like a city seen from above, lit by many small synchronized lights. This was also the period when NVIDIA explored becoming more than a GPU company, imagining a future where it could shape both the graphics side and the broader processor landscape. In 2020, NVIDIA announced a plan to acquire ARM, whose CPU designs live inside countless phones and devices, and whose architecture was spreading toward servers. The attempt did not succeed, held back by regulatory concerns and the delicate politics of foundational technology. But even the attempt revealed the direction of the company's mind. Whether through ownership or partnership, NVIDIA wanted a world where GPUs and CPUs worked together more closely, each optimized for its role, each helping the other. So they kept building new kinds of server CPUs, new interconnects, new ways to stitch computing into a seamless fabric. It's a story that feels, at this point, less like a product line and more like an ecosystem, a quiet landscape of tools designed to make complex work feel natural. And somewhere in that landscape, the original dream is still present, not just to make images beautiful, but to make computation itself smoother, wider, and more alive. They even began speaking about new categories like the DPU, a data processing unit meant to handle the busy work of networking and security. So CPUs and GPUs could focus on their main tasks. In a large cloud, that division of labor matters because every saved cycle becomes space for another training run, another simulation, another quiet experiment. So the architecture of modern computing began to look like a well-run port at night. Different cranes, different lanes, each moving its share, so the whole system flows without strain. By the time the 2020s arrived, the GPU had become something you rarely saw directly, like electricity behind a wall, present, necessary, and mostly unnoticed until something remarkable happens. That remarkable thing for many people was the sudden feeling that a computer could speak, not in stiff commands, but in flowing sentences, answering questions, writing drafts, composing small pieces of code. Generative AI is the name often used for this, but the experience is simpler than the label. You type a few words, and the machine responds with something that seems to understand the shape of language. Behind that softness is an immense amount of training, a long process where a model reads and predicts and adjusts again and again, learning patterns the way a musician learns scales. This training is repetitive math on a vast scale, and it thrives on parallel effort, which is why GPUs became the engines of the moment, packed into data centers like rows of quiet lanterns. In 2016, Jensen Huang even carried one of NVIDIA's early AI systems to OpenAI by hand, a symbolic gesture that felt almost old-fashioned. A founder delivering a machine to a small team, as if dropping off tools for a workshop. Years later, those tools had become entire fleets, and the fleets had become part of a new global infrastructure built so models could learn faster and be updated more often. If you think of the Internet as a library, then these training clusters are the late-night readers, turning pages at extraordinary speed, not for pleasure, but for pattern. The cultural ripple was immediate. Images generated from prompts, voices that could be synthesized, assistants that could help with daily writing, and a renewed debate about what creativity means. Yet the hardware story remained steady. Fans spinning, heat rising, racks glowing softly, and the GPU doing what it has always done best. Many simple steps repeated in parallel until complexity feels smooth. And as we move forward, we can keep one gentle thought in mind, that the most surprising revolutions are often powered by the least glamorous things, by infrastructure that simply keeps working all night long. For many, the first encounter had a name like ChatGPT, a small window on a screen that made the future feel oddly familiar, like sending a message to a thoughtful stranger. And almost overnight, more people learned the word GPU, not from gaming forums, but from headlines and conversations at work, as if the hidden engine had finally become part of the public vocabulary. Still, the GPU itself did not change its personality. It remained a patient calculator, turning data into learned behavior with the same calm repetition it once used to turn geometry into light. When a new technology becomes widely desired, the world begins to measure it in physical terms. How many chips, how many servers, how many megawatts of power, how much cooling, how much space. AI training is not just software. It is a landscape of machines, and that landscape has temperature, weight, wiring, and timing. NVIDIA's newer data center GPUs arrived with names that sounded like quiet tributes to scientists, and each generation brought more parallel capacity, more efficiency, more ability to move data through the chip without bottlenecks. But the real change was not only inside the silicon, it was in how the systems were built. GPUs linked together with fast connections, treated as one shared pool of compute. This is why networking mattered so much, and why NVIDIA cared about the whole stack. The GPU, the interconnect, the software libraries, the tools that schedule work, the way memory is managed. It is also why cloud companies invested heavily. turning AI compute into a service, renting out acceleration the way a city rents out office space. If you imagine a data center at night, it can feel surprisingly peaceful. A warehouse of quiet order, blinking lights, controlled air, steady redundancy. Inside, training jobs run for days, sometimes weeks, and the progress is incremental. A little better accuracy, a little more fluency, a little more stability. This kind of progress rewards patience, and patience has always been part of NVIDIA's character, shaped early by the knowledge that one failed chip can end a company. So the firm kept refining the same fundamental lesson. Parallel computing is a way to make the heavy feel light, as long as you respect the details. And as the demand rose, the world began to notice another truth, that computation is a physical resource, and that every new capability must eventually be paid for in power, heat, and careful engineering. Engineers began talking about packaging in memory as much as raw compute, because feeding the GPU is as important as the GPU itself, like making sure a fast train has enough track. High bandwidth memory, stacked close to the processor, helped keep the data flowing, and new systems use liquid cooling or carefully designed airflow to carry heat away quietly. In some places, the constraint became electricity, and companies planned new substations and new power contracts, as if AI were not only a software wave, but a new kind of industry. And yet, the mood inside those rooms remained calm. The hum of fans, the soft blink of status lights, and the sense that thinking in our modern world has become something we build. It's easy now to look at NVIDIA and see inevitability, to imagine a straight line from the diner breakfast to the modern data center, but the line was never straight, and the calm truth is that the company survived by repeatedly choosing the uncomfortable future over the comfortable present. Jensen Huang liked to talk about investing in $0 billion markets, meaning places where the opportunity is real but not yet visible, like a shoreline before sunrise. In the 1990s, 3D gaming felt like that, exciting but small, and easy to dismiss. In the mid-2000s, GPU computing for science felt like that, useful but niche and hard to monetize quickly. In the early 2010s, deep learning felt like that, a research curiosity that suddenly became practical only when data and GPUs made it practical. To keep making those bets, NVIDIA had to build a culture that could live with long timelines, and that is not a glamorous skill. It means spending years on software ecosystems that do not show up in product photos, compilers, libraries, documentation, developer support, the slow work of making tools trustworthy. It means accepting that a platform is not a single invention, but a relationship, one that deepens as more people build on it and as the company responds. If you have ever learned a craft, you know the feeling. Progress doesn't happen as a single leap. It happens as 1,000 small corrections, each one barely visible. NVIDIA's rise is built on those corrections. The way a graphics company learned to serve scientists, then learned to serve machine learning, then learned to serve the world's largest clouds. And through that, the company's original question remained intact. How do we make computation feel fluid so creativity and discovery can move without friction? Tonight, we can let that question settle like a warm stone in the hand. Simple, steady, and powerful in its persistence. You can hear the lesson most clearly in the crisis years when early products failed, cash grew tight, and the team shrank, not from lack of talent, but from the reality that hardware is expensive to get wrong. In that period, they learned to test a chip before it existed, running long emulations and listening closely for mistakes because they could not afford a second miss. When the recovery chip worked and sold, it did more than save the company. It taught them that speed is useful only when paired with rigor, and that survival is often a matter of details done calmly, correctly, and on time. That memory stayed with them, and it shaped how they approached every later pivot, with patience, with discipline, and with a willingness to rebuild their future from the inside out. Sometimes it helps to remember that all of this began with light. A game world is mostly light and timing. The illusion that a surface is curved, the suggestion that a hallway recedes, the gentle persistence of motion from frame to frame. In the Doom and Quake era, those worlds were assembled with clever shortcuts, and you could almost see the seams. But the excitement was real because your imagination filled in what the hardware could not. Then GPUs arrived, and the seams softened. Textures became richer, geometry more complex, and the mind stopped noticing the tricks. Later, with programmable shaders, developers could paint with equations, telling the GPU how water should shimmer, how smoke should fade, how skin should scatter light softly. Eventually, ray tracing brought the old dream closer, simulating the path of light itself, letting reflections and shadows behave more like they do in real rooms. It is easy to think of this as graphics, yet it is also a lesson about simulation, about using computation to imitate the physical world. And simulation, in a calm way, is a cousin of learning, because both require a great many small calculations to produce something that feels coherent. When AI models learn patterns, they are doing their own kind of rendering, not of light, but of language, of images, of the statistical shape of the world. The GPU's gift is the same in both cases. It handles repetition without complaint. It spreads work across many cores. It makes the heavy feel smooth. So the cultural story and the technical story keep touching. A teenager playing Unreal Tournament in a dim bedroom, and a researcher training an image model in a bright lab, both relying on the same kind of parallel engine. Tonight, you don't need to separate these threads. You can let them weave together and feel how a technology can grow by serving play first, then serving discovery, and eventually serving almost everything. Even the sounds are related. The click of a mouse, the low whirl of a fan, the faint heat rising from a PC case after a long session. Years later, the same kind of hum fills a data center, only steadier, more distant, as if the world's computing has moved from bedrooms into warehouses. And yet, the feeling is familiar. A machine working beside you, not demanding attention, just providing the smoothness that lets your mind stay in the story. This is why NVIDIA's rise can be told as a bedtime story at all, because it is, at heart, about making experiences feel calm and continuous, even when the work underneath is vast. The world slows, and the frames keep coming. A chip is a piece of silicon, but a platform is a habit. CUDA became that habit, slowly, as more developers learned it, as more libraries were built on top of it, and as more research results depended on its rhythms. Over time, NVIDIA's advantage was not only that its GPUs were fast, but that the path to use them was well lit. Documentation, tools, optimized code for common tasks. In machine learning, people began to rely on libraries that handled the hardest parts, the deep inner loops of training, the careful math for neural networks, the patterns that appear in almost every model. When those libraries are tuned for a specific platform, the platform becomes sticky, not through coercion, but through convenience and trust. Trust matters in computing because a researcher does not want to spend months debugging hardware quirks when the real goal is discovery. A company building an AI product does not want to reinvent the foundations. It wants to stand on something stable and keep moving. So, NVIDIA kept doing what it had learned from gaming. Cultivate developers. Support the people building content, because content is what makes hardware meaningful. In games, the content is worlds and stories and competition. In AI, the content is models and data and applications, speech recognition, vision systems, recommendations, scientific tools, creative assistance. The platform connects them all like a slow river that carries many boats. And the river's value increases as more people choose to float on it. Of course, the river is not alone. Competitors exist, alternative approaches exist, and the industry is always searching for efficiency. But NVIDIA's strategy was steady. Build the ecosystem, build the hardware, and keep them aligned so the experience stays smooth. If you listen closely, you can hear how this echoes the earliest days. The same desire to reduce friction, to make complex work feel simple, to keep the images or the learning flowing. In supercomputing centers, GPUs became standard equipment, and in cloud data centers, they became rentable resources. So a student with a small budget could access the same kind of acceleration as a large lab. That accessibility changed the pace of innovation. More experiments, more iterations, more chances for unexpected breakthroughs. And each time someone learned CUDA, taught it, used it, or built on it, the ecosystem deepened. The way a city becomes more livable as more roads, signs, and shared customs appear. It's a gentle kind of compounding, less dramatic than a headline, but more durable. The accumulation of tools, habits, and trust, all circling a parallel engine. So, when the world suddenly wanted more AI, NVIDIA was already there, not just with chips, but with a well-worn path that made those chips usable. As NVIDIA grew into AI, it also began to imagine where AI would live, not only in data centers, but in machines that move through the physical world. A self-driving car is, in a quiet sense, a perception machine. Cameras and sensors streaming data, software deciding what matters, computation turning patterns into action. This requires fast inference, the moment-to-moment use of a trained model, and it requires reliability, because the road does not pause while the computer thinks. So NVIDIA built platforms for automotive computing, pairing specialized hardware with software that could process sensor data and run neural networks in real time. The goal was not to sell a single chip, but to offer a foundation that car makers and robotics teams could build on, adapting it to their needs. At the smaller end, NVIDIA created compact modules for edge AI, tiny computers with GPU power used in drones, cameras, robots, and industrial devices. These systems are like the data center's distant cousins, still parallel, still repetitive, but living closer to the world of motion and dust and vibration. And beyond physical machines, NVIDIA leaned into simulation. The idea that you can build a digital environment, a kind of twin, and test systems there safely. Simulation has always been part of NVIDIA's heritage, because graphics is a form of simulation, and the GPU is a natural tool for building believable virtual spaces. In robotics, simulation is a gentle teacher, a place where a robot can fail without harm, learn without fear, and repeat an action thousands of times without getting tired. In industry, simulation helps engineers model factories, logistics, traffic flow, and energy systems, letting them explore possibilities before making expensive changes. So the company's story broadened again, from drawing pixels to accelerating science, to supporting learning, and now to helping machines perceive and act in the physical world. It is all one theme, really, giving computation a body and giving complex systems a calm place to practice before they meet reality. NVIDIA called some of these simulation efforts Omniverse, a shared 3D workspace where many tools can meet and where scenes can be rendered, changed, and replayed with quiet precision. For robotics, they built software stacks that helped teams train and deploy systems, often blending computer vision, planning, and control into one coherent flow. If you picture it, it feels like a calm rehearsal room. Virtual light, virtual gravity, virtual friction, all computed patiently, so the real machine can move with confidence later. And so, even here, the GPU's role remains consistent, It makes rich simulation and fast learning possible, turning repetition into readiness. While AI drew headlines, another quieter thread continued, one that NVIDIA had always served: the work of creators who build images, spaces, and stories. Film studios render scenes that never existed. Architects preview buildings before they are built. Designers rotate objects in 3D until the shape feels right. These tasks are heavy with geometry and light, and they benefit from the same parallel computation that powers games. So, NVIDIA's professional visualization tools kept evolving, supporting artists who care about subtle reflections, soft shadows, the way a surface looks under morning light. In some ways, this creative thread is a gentle bridge between eras, because it reminds us that the GPU's earliest purpose was to help imagination appear on a screen. What changed is scale and audience, and the way images now travel. A render created in one city can be shared instantly, edited collaboratively, and experienced on a phone across the world. The boundary between real and rendered grew softer, and not in a frightening way, but in a practical one, because simulation helps us plan, rehearse, and communicate. Even a simple social media filter, smoothing a face or adjusting a background, is part of this lineage, a tiny piece of accelerated computation applied to everyday life. And when AI began generating images from text prompts, it did so using learned patterns that still rely on GPU-accelerated math, echoing the old relationship between computation and art. You can see the continuity from a gamer watching a new lighting effect in a 2004 title to an artist using a neural tool to explore variations in 2024, both seeking the same thing: not novelty for its own sake, but a smoother path from idea to expression. In the SleepWise pace of this night, it's comforting to notice how often technology's goal is simply to remove friction, so the mind can stay with the creative act. The GPU, steady and patient, has been doing that for decades, turning mathematics into images, and now turning images and language into new kinds of shared possibility. Real-time rendering also changed how film and media are made, with directors walking through virtual sets before cameras roll, seeing lighting and composition in the moment instead of waiting days for final renders. That shift, too, is a kind of calm. Fewer surprises, more iteration, more room for gentle adjustment. And as the tools became faster, the creative process became more like conversation. Try a version, see it instantly refine, repeat, until the result feels inevitable. In that way, NVIDIA's rise is not only about machines learning, but about humans creating with less delay, as if the distance between thought and screen has quietly shortened. Every large story has its limits, and for modern computing, the limits are often physical, energy, materials, manufacturing capacity, and the quiet complexity of global supply chains. A high-end processor is not just design, it is fabrication, packaging, shipping, testing, and the careful assembly of components that arrive from many places. In the AI boom, those chains became visible because demand rose quickly, and the world learned that not all chips can be produced at will. There were also rules and restrictions shifting over time, influencing where certain advanced technologies could be sold, reminding everyone that computing lives inside a wider world of policies and priorities. NVIDIA navigated this by doing what it has always done, focusing on engineering, on efficiency, on making each generation of hardware do more work per unit of energy. Efficiency is a soothing concept when you think about it. The idea that you can accomplish more with less strain, that progress does not have to mean waste. In data centers, that efficiency shows up as better cooling, smarter scheduling, and architectures that avoid unnecessary movement of data, because moving data can be as costly as computing. In chips, it shows up as specialized units for common operations, and in software, it shows up as libraries that squeeze more usefulness out of each computation. All of this is a kind of invisible stewardship, the quiet effort to make the system sustainable as it scales. And as AI becomes more common, the world will keep asking the same calm question in new forms. How do we build intelligence without building too much friction? NVIDIA's answer, again and again, has been acceleration paired with integration, making the processor faster, yes, but also making the whole pathway smoother. Tonight, you don't need to hold the details, only the feeling that behind the scenes, an immense amount of careful engineering is trying to keep the future gentle. If you picture a silicon wafer, it's like a dark mirror, round and delicate, carrying many future machines in a single sheet. Lithography prints patterns too small to see, layer by layer, and each layer must align, as if the chip is being written in a microscopic calligraphy. Then comes packaging, where memory and processor are brought close together and where the physical distance between components becomes part of performance. When people say compute is the new oil, they often forget how tangible it is. Metal, water, power lines, and the calm logistics of keeping everything running. So the rise of AI has quietly renewed an old respect for infrastructure, and NVIDIA, a company born in graphics, has become one of the architects of that infrastructure. No company rises alone, and NVIDIA's story has always included rivals, alternatives, and the steady pressure that keeps a craft honest. In gaming, there were competitors making their own graphics cards, pushing price and performance in a cycle that benefited players. In data centers, cloud companies explored custom chips, building specialized processors for their own needs, and researchers experimented with many kinds of accelerators. This is natural, because when something becomes foundational, everyone wants to shape it. Yet, NVIDIA's endurance has often come from its platform approach, not only shipping hardware, but supporting it with software that makes the hardware practical. A custom chip can be powerful, But power without a mature ecosystem can feel lonely, like a road without signs. So NVIDIA continued to invest in the tools that let people build quickly. Compilers, libraries, drivers, and a wide set of partnerships across academia and industry. Competition also pushed NVIDIA to stay efficient, to keep improving performance per watt, to design systems that can scale without losing reliability. And in the background, a quieter competition existed as well, the competition against time, against complexity, against the tendency of systems to become fragile as they grow. It's surprisingly hard to keep an ecosystem stable while it expands, and stability is part of what people pay for, even if they don't always name it. So, the rise of NVIDIA is not a story of a single victory, but of continuous tuning, like keeping an instrument in tune as the temperature changes. Tonight, it's calming to remember that progress in technology is usually not a conquest, but a conversation. Many ideas, many approaches, and a slow selection of what proves dependable. NVIDIA has been one of the dependable answers for a long time, partly because it learned early that survival requires both speed and care. When engineers choose tools, they often choose the one that reduces uncertainty, the one that works across operating systems, across clusters, across generations of hardware. They choose the one with a community, with examples, with people who have already solved the sharp corners. That is why, even as alternatives grow stronger, many teams still return to NVIDIA's stack because it feels like a well-maintained path through dense forest. And as those alternatives improve, the whole industry improves. Better standards, better ideas, better efficiency, all feeding back into a healthier ecosystem. In that way, competition becomes another form of calm, a steady wind that keeps the air moving, preventing stagnation, encouraging everyone to keep refining their craft. If you step back, NVIDIA's rise can feel like a shift from the visible to the invisible. At first, you could see the change on your own screen. Smoother motion, richer colors, a game world that suddenly felt more alive. Then the change moved into places you rarely visit. Server rooms, research labs, data centers at the edge of towns, humming behind locked doors. And now, the results return to you through everyday experiences, better translations, smarter search, recommendations, image tools, voice assistants, and the quiet sense that software is becoming more conversational. It is the loop of modern infrastructure. Build it far away, and it comes back as something intimate. There is also a human loop, a loop of patience, founders taking risks, engineers iterating, developers adopting, researchers discovering, companies building on top. The story rewards the same qualities again and again: endurance, clarity, and the willingness to invest in tools that pay off slowly. It is tempting to focus on the famous moments: the first time the word GPU was said, the release of CUDA, the ImageNet breakthrough, the arrival of generative AI. But the SleepWise truth is softer. Those moments mattered because thousands of quieter decisions made them possible. A driver update that improves stability, a library that speeds up a common operation, an engineering practice that prevents a costly error, a support team that answers a question at the right time. This is the texture of real progress, not fireworks, but steady refinement. And perhaps that is why NVIDIA fits so well into a bedtime story, because it is not a tale of sudden magic, but of compounding craft. A company that began by making pixels move smoothly, spent decades learning how to make computation itself move smoothly, and in doing so, it helped the world build new kinds of thinking. Tonight, we can let that idea settle gently, that behind the modern glow of screens and services, there are patient engines and patient people, repeating small steps until the future feels natural. Some of those engines sit in cold climates where air is cheap and cooling is easy, and some sit in warm places where cooling systems work quietly all day. They sit near fiber lines and power substations, near highways that deliver replacement parts, near the unnoticed logistics that keep everything dependable. And while we sleep, they run, training, serving, calculating, making the modern world feel responsive, as if intelligence is always on call. It is a strange comfort, when you think about it, that so much activity can exist without demanding our attention. A hum we don't have to hear, a light we don't have to watch. So tonight, as the room darkens, we can carry NVIDIA's story like a small lantern. Steady, not urgent. A company begins with a question, survives its early missteps, learns to build with rigor, and then discovers that its tool can serve more than the first dream. First, it helps the world see smoother games, richer images, light, rendered with patience. Then it helps the world measure and simulate molecules, weather, medical images, the slow problems that require repetition. Then it helps the world learn, networks adjusting their weights, patterns emerging from data, machines becoming better at recognizing what we already know how to recognize. And then, quietly, it helps the world speak, language models that respond, image models that imagine, systems that feel like assistants rather than calculators. Underneath every stage is the same rhythm, parallel work, many small calculations done together so complexity can arrive without strain. You can picture it now as a gentle current, electrons moving through etched pathways, heat carried away by airflow, status lights blinking softly in a distant room. And you can picture the older version too, a bedroom PC in 1999, a bulky monitor, a new graphics card, a game loading, a world appearing frame by frame. If there is a lesson worth keeping, it is that technology rarely arrives in a single leap. It arrives through patience, iteration, and years of careful building. It moves through people willing to work on foundations, to make tools reliable, to choose the long path when the short one looks tempting. Now the world slows, and you do not need to hold any of it tightly. Let the images fade, let the servers hum somewhere far away, and let parallel work become a lullaby. Small efforts working together so the whole system can rest. Somewhere, a founder's early breakfast conversation becomes a decade of prototypes, then a platform, then an ecosystem that thousands of engineers quietly depend on. Somewhere, a creator renders a scene in real time, adjusting light until it feels like dusk, and the GPU turns math into atmosphere without complaint. And somewhere, a curious person opens a small window on a screen, asks a question, and receives an answer that feels calm, as if the machine has learned the contours of language. All of it is connected, not by spectacle, but by steady repetition, the kind that makes hard things seem simple and makes simple things feel smooth. So, as you settle deeper into the night, you can let the story drift away from names and dates and toward a softer understanding. Progress is often a quiet compounding of small choices. The hum continues in the distance, like wind through trees, like water through pipes, like a city breathing while its streets sleep. And here, in your own room, you can do the same. Breathe, soften, and let the day dissolve. Good night.